Hello and welcome to the Sexuality and Aging Masterclass. I'm Kira Hauer and I am so proud and honored to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Sonali Deepika, here to help us talk about and understand our sensuality more and understand what it means to be on a sensual path. Dr. Sonali, can we call you Sonali? Or
yes, of course.
Sonali and I met in Mexico, in the jungles of Mexico, learning to be sensual and sexual beings in a sexuality coach training program. And we both have very different backgrounds. I'm excited to hear from Sonali about what her background is because it's so interesting. But I really wanted to invite you here today in part because this is the module on emotions in motion. And so we're going to focus our conversation on emotions and the role that they play in our ability to connect to our sensual and sexual selves, and the role that they play when we can't too. So welcome, my friend.
Thank you. So good to be here.
And Sonali is in Mexico still.
I didn't leave. I stayed, I left, and I came back.
That's right. That's right. And your life is taking you on many twists and turns, right? You're a child psychiatrist and lived and worked in Chicago, right? You were born in England, I believe.
Right.
Major way to Chicago, and then went to Sri Lanka to follow your path and your passion around Ayurveda. And now into sensuality coaching.
Yes.
I love it. So one of the things I love about you, Sonali, is that you really have modeled listening to your inner voice and listening to your body's wisdom, and made very big changes in your life based on your ability to connect with your intuition. So I'm curious, what was it about sensuality that drew you to it?
That's a good question. I think that in my journey, there was initially so much of a focus on intellect and left-brained kind of functioning and awareness, and learning a lot of information and memorizing a lot of information, and like consuming in that kind of way, that once I had freed myself from that, as you mentioned, I was in Chicago for almost exactly 20 years. And that took me from medical school through a lot of training and then working in the field. Once I decided eventually to leave, and that was to pursue and to understand a totally different kind of healing that wasn't so cognitive, that was much more, it felt much more holistic to me, much more mind, body, spirit, when I had found Ayurveda, which I did find in the US. But once I left and made my way to Sri Lanka, where my parents are originally from, and was working at this Ayurvedic resort, and just kind of at that point found that Ayurveda there, it wasn't feeding the need that I went, or it wasn't quite as holistic. Then it was kind of like, when you're asking about sensuality, it was kind of like finding something or having this inkling of, I need to look into this more, this whole area of sexuality and sensuality and all of that, which had been something that I had ignored for pretty much my life up until that. I mean, not entirely, but in no way of like understanding or delving into it or really having much awareness of part of my body, and that part of my whole sense of being. It was like that was an area that I didn't go into. I had become a psychiatrist. I was very much delving into emotions, feelings, emotions, behaviors, and of course, as I mentioned, like the intellect piece. But this was like an area of our health and our holistic way of being that I hadn't delved into much. So it was very surprising. There's nothing else that I would even have this inkling of like, oh, I should really look into that.
Mm-hmm.
And our teacher, or the person who was our teacher, I had found her work. When I look back, it's like I found her a couple of years before then and completely ignored all of her emails and all of her everything. It was way too much then for me to even think about. And when I was then in Sri Lanka, I'm like, oh, I want to look into this more. Then I started looking into Tantra and retreats, and I wasn't too far from Thailand, but that all seemed very scary, to be honest, like to go to something and there's men and women. I just didn't know. I was like, no, that doesn't sound, it did not feel like safe to me. It didn't feel like, yeah, safe was just, I guess, the main thing. And then I was reminded of that teacher, Lael Martin, that I had come across before. And then she had an online, like a shorter online course that I went into. So it was, I share, in sharing all that, I'm also attempting to convey the amount of resistance that I have had to face in my own body, in my own life, in my own world. It was not like, for some, and that's great, sensuality comes so easily, and it was something, that came very naturally. And, I think there are people that did our program that it was the case for them. It was not for me. I did not look at any of that. I didn't even let myself, I didn't even know. And it was very like, there was a lot of shame, and there was a lot of cultural pieces and familial pieces and a whole bunch of resistance that kind of said pleasure is not okay, and sex was not okay unless you're married, like that kind of very traditional thinking. So yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that you shared that, because I think that will resonate with a lot of people, because really what you're talking about is resistance and where resistance comes from, and shame and how it shows up, and the influences that create these emotions in our body that really I feel creates such a blockage to being able to access that deep reserve of pleasure that we have.
Yeah.
But so how did you find, what did you find helped you to be able to address, accept, manage, melt, call it what, the whole process of resistance? How did you deal with that and manage it? And I know that it's not just a one time, okay, we're going to address this and it's going to go away, right?
Right.
This is probably a lifetime of shedding, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So how have you found that you've done that within yourself? And then what do you see works for people in general? Because you've been doing a lot of teaching of this work.
I mean, it's a great question. And I think at some point there is, and this didn't come like right away, this is after, being in it for a while and being frustrated and being like, how come other people are having ecstatic, blissful?
Yep, I remember that feeling.
I don't know what I'm feeling. Not that.
Right.
But I think there is one thing that's helped me, and that I think helps others in understanding this also, is to have, to see if we could bring an acceptance to the resistance,
Mm.
to see if we can bring an acceptance that this is there and it's something that we work with, that it's there from all kinds of ways. I mean, they could be very clear sometimes if it's depending on if it's a religious upbringing or, some kind of value system in families or some kind of thing that's very, very clear.
Mhm.
But some we may not know what it is, and it's just there. And the more that we understand about, trauma, for example, and things like that, it's a lot passed down in ways through the generations, so that, like, you and I are holding things that from our parents or grandparents, their parents, I just go back way back, but it's still here, it's still in our bodies.
Mhm. Mhm.
So all that to say is that there's no quick, like, melt it or do something with it, get rid of it. The amount of resistance seems comparable to the greatness that is available when you get through it. So if we're talking about sensual pleasure, sexual pleasure, orgasmic pleasure, to me, that is huge. That is very high up on our hierarchy of pleasure that we can experience in this lifetime. And
Mhm.
so if we think about that, then understandably, the level of resistance that is to something that is of such a high magnitude, potentially, it's going to be big, so.
Really interesting.
Mhm,
Huh. Yeah, I could see where that would be because the stakes seem higher, right?
mhm,
The
mhm,
yeah, that's such an important distinction too.
mhm. I think, and we are talking about this topic, but just to shift, to give a parallel, um, I remember very much, this is a different thing, this is related to business, but in our course, there was a point early on where I decided, I'm buying this domain, I'm going to create this business, and there was so much anxiety around it. And there was so much, I had so many things that are coming up when I did that. And I still remember, it was the one class that I raised my hand in with in our course. And I was told, the closer you get to your life's calling, the greater the rumbling. And so I say that to kind of, we shift it back to what we're talking about with
Mhm.
sexuality, with sensual and sexual pleasure, orgasmic pleasure, all that. This
Mhm.
is a big,
Mhm.
this is a big thing. This is something that we all have a birthright to. And yet this is something that there are layers and layers and layers of conditioning and resistance that build against us experiencing that. And part of this work is to stay with it, just to stay with it, because it's going to throw us off over and over. It'll be like, I don't know what I'm doing. This doesn't make sense. Feels awful, because we have to experience those layers. We're kind of, slowly experiencing things as soon as we set our intention, as with, the students of this course, or you and I, when we went in pursuing our coaching program, we set our intention on that, and in doing so, we pull up the resistance to be worked with. So I think it's just really important to understand that it's part of it,
Mm.
and if you are facing it, you're on the right path.
Mm. Beautiful. Oh, that's so helpful, right? Because
Mhm,
I know for myself, having faced so much resistance, right?
mhm,
And then watching it with clients, the I think the sense is, oh God, this is just not worth it. You know, why am I doing this? What, like this resistance? Why am I feel like a, you know, salmon swimming upstream or something. Like, this is insane. Why am I doing this? You know? And so, but I think the reminder that you're giving us is the ultimate goal is so worth it, you know, or the ultimate, I don't know about goal, because also when I start hearing goals, I start,
know.
oh God, it's like, oh God, we don't want to put, you know, so
I know it's a lot of pressure.
it's a lot of pressure, too much pressure. And I, you know,
Pressure.
I actually, I think that there is a tendency, especially in our field, and you and I have talked about this a lot, about, you know, focusing on what's not working in the woman, in the woman's body, in the, you know, where is the sexual dysfunction, or, you know, and the reality is that it's rarely ever about something that's not working within her.
Oh,
You
right.
know? And
Right.
and that, you know, whether it's the health of a relationship, whether it's the ultimately the kind of technique and skills of her partner, or whether it's, you know, all of these blockages that we're talking about, right? That I don't know, I guess where I want to get to is not focusing so much on the, like, the goal of, you know, blissful orgasm, but the understanding that with that process, because we're starting to work on this resistance and understand ourselves more and get to a deeper core self, that in and of itself is empowering.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, it's the empowerment process
Yes.
that is the goal, not so much the, you know,
Right.
the boom at the end, right?
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm saying it because I'm in order to give a framework for why the resistance is there.
Yeah.
But I agree, it's not about that. At a certain point, it's not even about it. It's really about the little pieces, like bringing in little bits of pleasure, bringing in a little bit more, trying different things, finding what turns us on, like what makes us feel good. And it doesn't even have to be like sexual, but just bringing in more of, yeah, that which makes us feel good, like focusing on that. Like, how do I feel good? What brings me joy? What brings me pleasure? And kind of having that be like, it's making it smaller, you know, like these little things that actually really does help melt the resistance away, because there's just a less resistance to, I'm going to massage my body with some oil, my just part of my, whatever it is, you know, just a little bit of something that feels really good,
Right.
brings pleasure, and, you know, is really so soothing and nourishing. That kind of thing has less of this bam, like we
Yeah.
hit
Like, okay,
numbness and
I need to
we're
self
stuck.
pleasure because it's good for me, and it's, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So we can really bring it into working with our senses and what nourishes, soothes, pleases our senses, and we can start to work with that. But just setting on that, when we decide like pleasure is important, that and with that, in some part of us, probably because this was for me, I mean, the retreat that brought me from Sri Lanka to Mexico was called Wild Bliss. I mean, it really wasn't subtle.
Yeah. Right.
It was kind of like, whoo, what's
Yeah.
gonna happen? Then of course, you know, it was like
Up came the resistance.
brought a lot of resistance. So we might have this bigger thing and the resistance, but then we can work with like just little bits of the pleasure, you know, in a way that feels natural and feels good, and that really is a good way
Yeah.
to work with resistance.
So what I'm hearing you saying is a couple of different things. One is that when we declare to ourselves or to the world that we want to increase our pleasure, we will see resistance show up. It's like they go hand in hand, right? And as you said, your point about, your business, it's like the closer you get to that, the more will rumble up, the more fear will come up, the more resistance will come up, the more excitement will come up. There's just more emotion to it, right?
Yes.
So there's the resistance piece, and then there's the titrating piece, which is to, when you feel that there's resistance, to titrate the pleasure, right? I remember Layla saying, if you have a lot of resistance, to remember that if you are doing like pain practices, meaning letting go of or practices that feel painful, and I don't mean physically, I'm talking emotionally here, like let's say connecting to your inner child, if that feels painful, that you need to do many more pleasure practices, right? And I think that, and you can speak to this much more than I can from the field of psychiatry, do you feel like people have a tendency to go down the road of pain to address their emotional issues more than they do the path of pleasure? Or is that just
Great question?
Is that an assumption that I'm making? Because
No, I wanted to say one thing before that, just to say in a different way what I've said and what you said about the resistance. Another way to think about it is that once we start pursuing, or once we name, this is what we want, this is what we desire, and we start to take action, everything that prevented us from getting it in the first place starts to show up. So it's like I'll go back to my other example with I've never had a business before. And it's like, oh my God, I'm going to have a business. So I buy this domain, I take an action step. Yeah. And that's when it was like so much anxiety and so much doubt. What am I doing? Like all that stuff like showed up because I took an action step. So similarly with this pleasure idea, it can kind of be there. Pleasure, I want pleasure, I desire that. But it really shows up when we start to take action. It just kind of pulls the resistance up to the surface, that kind of occurred to me as you were talking, to mention that. And then coming to your question about, it's a good question, and it's a good point really about, it's kind of like we are somewhat wired to focus on our pain, to focus on our suffering. And it's like what you mentioned that Layla had said, if there's something that is causing pain, we need a whole lot more pleasure. Similar, and another analogy that comes with that, with Gottman, who's done a lot of work with relationships, if you're going to say something negative, he has that ratio of, you got to say 7 positive things to outweigh the one negative comment you're going to make to your partner, kind of thing. And I think because of all that how charged that pain is and how charged the negativity is, it drags us down that, it makes it hard for us to focus on other things. So if we're having a difficulty in this case, like let's say with sexuality, with relationship, with some kind of, aspect of sexual functioning, then we are likely to like focus on that becomes bigger and bigger, in our awareness. And then it becomes this big problem, and something's wrong with me, and trying to fix
Mhm.
ourselves, trying to fix the problem and everything. So um, I think it really does take a lot of just the awareness and effort to shift away to do something that could be um, bringing more pleasure in, like
Mhm.
to see the problem and or see the issue and
Mhm.
call it a problem. It's just something that's there,
Yeah.
and then kind of choose a path that's more about bringing in pleasure. In fact, this was a big part of the shift I noticed in, and it's on so many different levels, and it's not so simple. But when I was in psychiatry, it was all about problems and pain and suffering and all this kind of stuff. And there was a huge focus on that, and trying to figure out what to do. But the focus of what I spend a lot of time talking with people about was related to pain, and then in finding this work, um, it really brought in a different way of looking at things, a different perspective, and a different approach, and
Mhm.
not to the same thing. So I will just say that. I mean, in psychiatry, it's like can be really severe. I'm not trying to say that they need to just focus on pleasure and it would be fine. I'm not saying that, but it's for me as an individual working in these kind of healing areas, it was a refreshing shift. you know.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. So, what are some of your personal favorite practices, tools, strategies around building our sensual selves?
Mm. Um, I really, I really find for me, it's very making things very simple and small, and bringing them down to like a focus on the senses. So, um, just even like scents and um, oils and a lot of like just like touch. It like doesn't take long, but it can feel really good, and just kind of creating a little experience. I don't have a bathtub here. There's not as many bathtubs in Mexico, but I used to love that kind of thing. But if I can't really do bathtub, but more um, shower with like something that smells really good, that feels really good. I love like stuff with the skin, like exfoliating, and it's just like bringing in that awareness to the senses to like take in almost like it is a very nourishing experience, I
Mhm.
think. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it feels like it's to me. When I hear you say this, and also what I've noticed for myself is, it's really about presence. Right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's about presence. It's about bringing our mindful awareness into our bodies and then sensing for sensation, right? Sensing
Hmm.
like, oh yeah, oh that smells so good, and allowing that
Hmm.
to really absorb into our bodies. And yeah, it kind of comes down to slowing things down too,
Yeah,
right?
it's really about slowing things down for me,
Mhm.
anyway.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
we move at such a
Mm.
fast clip
Right.
in our worlds, and I think that's part of a major part of the problem, certainly for women in some sexual relationships, right?
Yeah. Mm.
It's about, it's unfortunately the focus is on speed, which is
Hmm.
ridiculously um, well, limited. Let's just put it that
Yeah.
way. And usually pretty unsatisfying. So I'm curious, Sonali, what other thoughts do you have about emotions in motion and sensuality?
Mm.
that you'd like to share with us?
Um, well, I think, which is, I think what you mean with this emotions and motion that I tend to, especially with this work, bring things into the energetic
Mhm.
like spheres. So um, I think about that way with emotions as well, and emotions as like energy and sensations as well come into they're experienced at a very, very, very deep level of our nervous system. So it's like our primal nervous system. It's that animal, like reptilian part of the brain, which just sensing. So it's like, if it's energy and if it's like these, like sensations, it's at that deep level. And the beneficial part about that is when we can slow down and we can experience these things at such a subtle level. It's very subtle, very, very subtle. That's the thing. It's not going to be experienced in a fast way. But when we can, we are actually bypassing a lot of conditioning and a lot of this other, what's in our cortex and what's in where we're actually processing emotions, but when we can get it into this subtle level. So I think it's sometimes just understanding that can be helpful to know that a lot of times, the example I give a lot is that anxiety, like nervousness and excitement, tend to feel very similarly at the level of sensation in the body. It's just that it feeds back, and then we have interpretations.
Mhm. Mhm.
Interpretations about, oh, I'm nervous and whatever. But if we were to shift that a different way, I'm excited about this, and it's a totally different experience. It can really affect our experience, how we're processing. So that was one thing that was coming to me, is just to remember, or just to bring awareness that we can experience both our sensations and emotions as like energy and motion at a very subtle level, if we want. Um, and the other thing is that when thinking about emotions as energy and motion, um, I think it helps in understanding that when emotions come up, they're like any other stimuli that we have, that it's meant to come up, to be felt, and to release. To come up, to be felt, to release. Now, much easier said than done, of course, when it comes to certain emotions. But when we are not like able to, and there will be times we won't, it's just life and difficult things, but when we're not really able to allow it to like come up, be felt, released, it's getting held there in the body, and it kind of then contributes to what can show up as resistance, or what can feel like a block, or what can feel really stuck because something's not moving.
Mm.
Like it's kind of, they're meant to just flow,
Right.
through, kind of thing.
So this goes back to the whole kind of closing the stress cycle,
Mm-hmm.
right? Being able to release it.
Mm-hmm.
We You see dogs do this, right? When they shake off, they're not shaking because they're cold. They're shaking because they're shaking an emotion off, and they're moving to the next one.
Yeah.
So sounds like we need to do the same thing. So how do we do that? What are the practices that you recommend for closing the stress cycle or releasing emotion?
Um, well, there's a lot of different things that can be done. The first thing would be just to identify okay, I'm feeling something, or it feels intense, or just to like have an awareness that, okay, I'm in this right now, And then like you were saying about the dogs, like moving is a good one. Shaking, just us shaking everywhere is a good way to like, at least the idea is if we can catch it and be aware of it, it won't get like stuck and stay, and then become more difficult. Everything can be released, everything. But, so the idea is to like, so if you can shake, move, breathing, really taking some really deep breaths where your exhale is longer than your inhale to really allow a bit more. It shifts us into our parasympathetic, our relaxation, stress response. Breath work. I know you and I just talked about that, but
it's a lot.
It really is something very powerful because it's getting at accessing the very subtle sensations, so it allows that whole process of bringing awareness, feeling, and releasing like to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many things like writing, like anything to kind of, so that think about like it's things that keep this energy moving. It's when we just lie in our bed, which we might need to do sometimes, but just lie there, do nothing, like that's probably not, that is just sitting there and it's okay. But to really like move something through, it takes a bit of some kind of movement, even if it's like writing, it's moving.
Mm-hmm. Or crying, right?
Or what?
Crying is
crying. Yes. Talking to someone.
Banging a pillow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that is challenging, especially for women, is the whole conversation around anger. And what do we do with our anger? We have a whole section in this module around the dance of anger, based on Harriet Lerner's work, and I think that this idea that that anger is so seen as so negative, it's seen as something that is so off limits for so many women. We're not even conscious of how deep that goes.
Yeah.
How scary our anger is to other people and to ourselves. And yet anger is a clue, just like any other emotion, right? That there's something that's not right. There's something that's not going right, and we need to address that, right? But it's so hard to connect with that anger.
It really is. And it is one, like I was thinking, like anger, shame, kind of like disgust, like these kind of emotions, when those are stuck in us, it has such negative consequences. But yeah, anger, like the pillow, like really getting it out, or kicking, or like, just vocalizing it, like some way of getting out. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, doing those primal screams, and which can be super scary for the neighbors. You want to do that in a careful kind of way, right?
Yeah, you can do things into a pillow also, or into your hands,
Right. Do you find that it's important though to connect with that emotion? Like, let's say that somebody says, I know that I'm stuck, and I know I'm stuck because I feel, I don't know, frustrated about this relationship, but it's almost like it's in their thinking mind, and they've been at this emotion, I should say, for so long, it's become a mood, right? Do you find that those kind of cathartic stress cycle practices also help when somebody is kind of in that state of mood? Or do you find that they're more helpful when somebody is really in the emotion? Do you know what I'm asking? Is that a clear enough question?
But tell me, like, when they're in the emotion, what do you mean by that?
Like if they,
Yeah.
so, you know how when you feel your emotion and it comes on, that energy that you talked about, right? I've read some psychologists, psychiatrists say that an emotion only lasts about 90 seconds or a couple of minutes, you know, that the emotions are moving, right? But do you find that it's helpful if somebody can talk about how frustrated they are, but maybe they're not really showing that they're frustrated. They've just been frustrated for so long. Would you direct them to go and do a cathartic kind of practice, or would you have them really drop into that emotion first? You know what I guess I'm trying to say, like, is the goal to have them really feel the emotion, and then while the emotion is really alive, they go into the practice of letting it go?
I think I understand. And I would say for the person who's like, it's in the thoughts, it's in that, I think that for that, it is really helpful to do the cathartic part, because you're bringing it into the body more. And maybe it's not going to get that there any other way, but that by actually using the body and doing the motions and the sound and, you know, whatever feels good to release, and then to see what shifts afterwards, you know, like maybe it can really, you know, some of this is like shifts. What kind of little shifts can we do?
Right.
And then it allows us a different perspective, and something that was stuck in our thinking, you know, wheel of thinking, like, can shift out, or something that's stuck in some part of our body can, you know.
So a lot of the women, well, all of the women in this course, are in their midlife. They're 50 and older, and you know, this is they're looking to reclaim their second spring, redefine it, you know, find more vitality and energy, and so forth. And I say that, and many are struggling also with their own feelings about the aging process, their aging bodies, and feeling like there's a lot of emotion around that. Can you speak to that a little bit about what you might recommend, or what you feel about that part of a woman's life?
I mean, I think it's such an important part of the whole cycle, right? And I think, like, when I hear that from you, it just reminds me of the importance of allowing us, or allowing space to grieve when there's a shift in our, you know, when we're going through these different parts of our cycle. Now, you know, earlier in a different part of the cycle, it might not have felt grief, maybe wouldn't have been the right term or something, but it's always whenever we shift from something to something, we're losing and we're gaining, you know. But that kind of space, the space between chapters kind of thing, as they say, that's such a beautiful time. It's such a potent time. It's such an important time to, like, honor what's happened and what has been, whatever the things, you know, the accomplishments or the celebrations, you know. And then maybe in that there are some feelings of loss as the body naturally shifts, and in our world where there are certain values that weren't necessarily the case in, you know, like indigenous cultures and things, where that was such an amazing transition to become more of this, like, wisdom keeper kind of person. It's just, we are in a culture that values youth, and things about youth, you know, that really overvalues that. And this brings up a sense of loss, as we're going through that, and our bodies are changing, um, and various other, we're changing at like all the different levels, physically, emotionally, energetically, spiritually, sexually. Everything's going through a change, but I think when we can allow ourselves that space and that time, again, something we don't do just in our culture, the culture, Western culture, doesn't allow for that much, but when we can, to like slow down and really give give respect and honor to what we've been through, and acknowledge anything that we notice about a feeling of loss, and then welcome what's to come.
Mhm. Mm. So beautiful. Oh, so beautiful. I know that will resonate. Yeah, that will definitely resonate. Um, you have some pretty amazing programs. I know because I've taken one of them. About shedding your shame and connecting to your sensual sovereignty, which is an amazingly powerful term. So can you tell us a little bit about what is getting you excited about your work right now, your life, and your offerings to the world?
Thank you. Yes, I have, in the process of this work, I found myself drawn to this idea of sensual sovereignty. And I think of it like embodied love, liberation, and the opportunity to expand the essence, our true essence kind of thing. Really like that, a sense of wholeness, and a sense of self-trust in our bodies. And so I still am kind of feeling into it, like what this is and what's going to come with it. But I'm offering now just like a monthly new moon. Well, you came to the first one.
Yeah.
Shed the shame and reclaim your authentic power. So I'm going to do it again this month, and hopefully it's something that will continue. I really appreciated the sense of community and guiding women through this. And I do want to, I will be offering eventually a group program, but it keeps shifting a little bit. So,
Well, I have
yeah.
to say, from my perspective, having been a participant in that, it was a very, very powerful workshop. And what I loved your connecting it to the new moon. I think that one of the things that we don't do enough is create ritual.
Yeah.
We don't put enough intention behind what we're doing with our lives. And so going back to our conversation about presence, if we can presence ourselves in our lives in a different way, then it creates a shift. Almost nothing else has to change except for our attention and our awareness and the intention behind it. So the intention of connecting to the power of the new moon is really powerful. You know? And the moon isn't going anywhere. It's the same moon that was there before you had that intention, right?
Right.
Putting that intention on it and feeding our divine feminine, feeding our sensual and sexual selves, feeding our yin and our yang that you had us play with, which was so powerful. It's really, I really appreciate that. And I also think it takes us away from this kind of focus on what's wrong.
Mhm.
and celebrates what's available to us,
Mhm.
you know, from Mother Earth to Mother Self,
Yeah,
right?
that's so
It's,
true.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
so beautiful. Well, Sonali, I cannot thank you enough. This was incredible, so helpful, provocative, informative, moving, all of it. I'm not surprised in the least. So if people want to find you, they can find you at iamsacredground.com,
Yeah.
correct? Is that the
Yes.
best place to find you?
That's a good place. And the same, I am Sacred Ground at Instagram.
Yes, yes. And I follow you religiously.
Yes, I do
Great.
you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for
Thank
joining me,
you.
and I'll look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.